From programs which will link the day will not be complete. The row around Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir's visit to the AU summit still rages on, especially on social media. The South African Litigation Centre is now contemplating bringing contempt of court proceedings. This after the Sudanese president was allowed to leave South Africa earlier this week, despite a High Court order ordering the state not to allow him to depart. Al-Bashir was in Sandton, near Johannesburg, to attend the African Union summit. Meanwhile, the African Union Commission chairperson, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, says there was nothing untoward about Omar Al-Bashir attending the AU summit. She says the summit was governed by AU rules and South Africa had nothing to do with it. Bashir's attendance caused outrage, with the ICC demanding that South Africa arrest him for war crimes he committed in Darfur. Now, South Africa's Litigation Centre started all the row around the presence of Al-Bashir in South Africa. International criminal justice lawyer at the SABC, Angella Mudukuti, joins us this morning to take this discussion a little bit forward. Very good morning to you, Angela. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Contentious issue. Let's start at the beginning because there's so much to get through. But I want to start at the beginning with the contempt of court proceedings. How do you want to proceed with this and to what end?
Okay. First of all, we are waiting for the reasoning from the court. The court issued an order but said it would issue its actual reasoning and judgment later on. And we're also waiting for an affidavit from the state explaining how it was that Bashir escaped and which port of entry he went through and who was responsible for that. So when we've received all that information, we'll then decide how to proceed. So at this point, we're not speculating about what we're going to do. We need the right information first.
You are of the view that he escaped?
Absolutely. I mean, he's a fugitive of justice. He's wanted by the ICC. He's been indicted for 10 counts of crimes against humanity, genocide and war crimes. Okay,
let's go back then. Why in the first place did you take this view and the matter to the High Court? Please just explain it to us, the sort of backstory for yourself.
Absolutely. So Bashir was indicted by the ICC in 2009 and again in 2010 for genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Darfur region after an insurgency that started in 2003. So from that point on, he's been wanted by the ICC. South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statute of the ICC and has domesticated the Rome Statute into domestic legislation by way of the ICC Act. And by virtue of those commitments made at the international level and at domestic law level, South Africa has obligations to arrest Bashir.
What about the African Union and the kinds of immunity that goes with what happens at an event such as this? It only happens to be in South Africa, to have been held in South Africa. How do you view, let's call it the point of view of Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma?
I would have to respectfully say that that is inaccurate. The AU summit was held on South African territory, hence South Africa has jurisdiction. And I'd like to use the example of Malawi in 2012. They were scheduled to host the AU summit, and they bluntly said they would not host Al-Bashir, and the summit was moved to Ethiopia. So this question of, oh, because the AU summit is in South Africa, it's AU rules, incorrect. South African land, South African jurisdiction.
What about the greater good, the principle of the greater good, that we here in Africa, we are trying to create a prosperous Africa at peace with itself? The gentleman in question is involved in skirmishes that is destabilizing not just a country but an entire region. South Africa finds itself in the middle of a process to try and broker some sort of deal. Your response?
I think we need to remember that there are victims here and that justice and accountability is very important for any sort of peace building in the future. And for as long as fugitives of justice are allowed to prevail and to travel freely and not answer to charges before international courts, we're not building a prosperous and successful and peaceful Africa.
What about the legitimacy of the ICC? The AU questions it, South Africa questions it, I question it. How do you view it?
I think the ICC has come under attack, but I also think we need to remember that it has a massive global mandate. Accountability for genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity is not an easy task. I still think the institution has great legitimacy, and I think it needs support and critical engagement. We can criticize the ICC. We can talk about how UN Security Council referrals get to the court. I mean, there are many, many aspects we could discuss, but that doesn't mean we don't need to support it.
I hear exactly what you are saying, but here in Africa, we feel we've been at the effect of these kinds of, let's call it easy targets. Easy to target African leaders, isn't it? It's easy to make African leaders the scapegoat for all the ills and all the human rights abuses in the world, when the great human rights abuses around the world go unpunished and I believe unseen by the ICC. Even in this instance, the ICC parked the matter of Al-Bashir and said, oh, we're not going to investigate it. We will rest our case on this matter so far. Only when he came to South Africa this weekend, suddenly became an issue. It feels as if there is a scapegoat mentality within the ICC.
First of all, let me correct something. So the Bashir case came to the ICC because it was a referral from the United Nations Security Council, referral 1593. And since then, the ICC has been investigating this process and has indicted both sides of the conflict, so the rebel movement as well as the Darfur government. But they've received very little support from the Security Council and obviously from Darfur and Sudan itself. So they've been forced to put the matter on ice because they're not being given access to victims, to witnesses, and to evidence. So I wouldn't say that they've parked the matter. I would say that the situation and circumstances have made it difficult for them to proceed.
They didn't investigate further. They didn't see fit to spend more money on this case because obviously their advice pointed to the fact that there could really be no result to it. That's why they parked it. And it speaks a lot about the kind of vigilance and the kind of way that there's this follow through. I want to take the discussion a little bit further.
Right.
When we talk about war criminals and crimes against humanity, where do crimes against humanity in places like Palestine, in places like Iraq, and the wider Middle East, Syria and so forth, where does this sit within the ICC, and where does it sit with someone like yourself?
I'm glad you brought that up because this brings to light the jurisdictional limits of the ICC. There are three ways in which something comes before the ICC. If you're a signatory to the Rome Statute, you can do what is known as a self-referral. The prosecutor can exercise a jurisdiction, or the United Nations Security Council can bring a referral. And these are the only three ways in which a case comes before the ICC. And you're right, the ICC does have jurisdictional limits, because now we only see Palestinians come before the court because Palestine has signed and ratified the Rome Statute, which is the only way justice can be done in that context. And yes, the United States hasn't signed. Yes, we have questions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but those are geopolitical constrictions. And we need to challenge the ICC on its jurisdiction, but not criticize it for not having jurisdiction. So we should talk about why hasn't China and Russia referred Syria, for example, to the ICC? Politics. It's not in their interest to refer Syria or Zimbabwe or any other country, or Iraq or Afghanistan. So the ICC has limits, is my point.
So that says everything about the work that the ICC can really do and the legitimacy of the organization. And one can then see why it becomes easy to target African leaders.
Well, I don't think African leaders are being targeted. We have legitimate crimes that have been committed and legitimate victims. Who's going to speak for the African victims? I mean, let's look at our own continent at the moment. The SADC tribunal, currently disbanded, and in future may not have access for individuals. Who's going to hear the grievances of Southern African victims? The African court, no criminal jurisdiction. Who's dealing with their issues? So the ICC is not targeting Africa, but is instead addressing the fact that there are crimes that are being committed and using the fact that they can exercise jurisdiction. So should we forget about Africa because we can't go after George Bush?
What about
I'm not sure that makes sense.
What about, you talk about George Bush. Why is it then that we have an international body that is set to police crimes against humanity and the like, but the biggest country in the world, the United States, is not a member, is not a signatory of the ICC. Without the US being part of this process, it certainly lacks legitimacy there as well. Or is it a law for certain countries and a different set of laws for another?
I am 100% with you that it is problematic that the US is not a member of the ICC. But the fact that the ICC functions regardless of that is also something we should notice. Because we have other powerful countries that are signatories to the Rome Statute, the UK, France. So I don't think just because the US is not doing something that we should all abandon the court. I think instead we should challenge the US and its various, its dodgy criminal human rights record and see what we can do there.
Do you think it would send the right message to African leaders if somebody like Tony Blair and the weapons of mass destruction scenario that played out about a decade ago, if someone like that appears before the ICC, surely it would pave the way for others to step forward and say, well, if Tony Blair is prepared to stand for the creation that was the, let's call it the war in the middle, or the war in Iraq, then we should do the same.
I think it would definitely help the ICC to expand the geography of its docket. Absolutely, I agree with you. How that has to happen, though, we have to follow the law and follow jurisdiction.
And just clear up, before I let you go, the law now that you would like to see take its course, the man is back in Khartoum.
Yes.
What's the point then now of us continuing with this discussion before the courts?
I think what we have to look at here is that South Africa, the South African government, has defied a court order. That is what we need to look at now. And that doesn't bode well for rule of law in South Africa and for the understanding that South Africa is a constitutional democracy built on human rights and justice. I think that's the issue we have to address now.
When we deal with law, we don't look at the principle of the greater good.
Well, law is about the greater good. Justice is about the greater good. Accountability is about the greater good.
Thank you for joining us today. Wonderful, wonderful views. That is Angella Mudukuti, who is a criminal justice lawyer at the Southern African Litigation Centre. Of course, we spoke about well, the recent going-ons around a visit, Omar Al-Bashir, and of course